Hello, everybody. My name is Siniša Milatović. Welcome to the panel on business and human rights in the digital era. I'm a business and human rights specialist at UNDP. I'll be moderating today's panel, during which we will explore the impact of the rise of digitalization on human rights with four great panelists. And these are Lena Wendland, the head of business and human rights at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations, Nighat Dad of the Digital Rights Foundation and a member of Facebook's Oversight Board, Tana Sullivan, the head of sustainability at Gojek, and Wahyudi Jafar of the Institute of Policy and Advocacy, ELSAM. So without further ado, I would first like to ask Lena, as this panel is co-organized with OHCHR and its BTEC project, to give a quick overview and a presentation of the project itself. Lena, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to be speaking at this event, and it's a great pleasure to work with our UNDP colleagues to organize this event on a very important topic in the broader business and human rights domain. I've got some slides that are now up, and I'm assuming that everyone can see them on the screen. So I'm going to talk about the UN Human Rights BTEC project, as was mentioned. And I'll go into the details about what the project is, but start by just stating the obvious, I guess, that the entry point and the foundation for the work that we're doing in this space is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That is the core authoritative normative framework at the United Nations for business and human rights. Obviously, we have very strong collaboration with OECD and the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct, and which is very much aligned with the UN Guiding Principles, but we do use the Guiding Principles as our foundation. And I'm sure most listeners to this session would know that this was the framework that we are shortly celebrating the 10th anniversary. It was presented by Professor John Ruggie, who was then Special Representative of the Secretary General to the Human Rights Council, who unanimously endorsed the Guiding Principles in 2011, 16th of June. 2011, and thereby creating for the first time an authoritative global framework that articulates in detail the responsibilities, the standard of responsibility for all business enterprises, but also importantly, elaborates on the obligations of states to protect against business-related human rights abuses, and as important, if not more, also reinforces and reiterates the right of those whose rights have been impacted to find effective remedies through effective processes. So the Guiding Principles is this strong normative foundation, but also because of the support from all member states of the Human Rights Council and beyond, as well as endorsement by international business organizations and many civil society organizations, it also is underpinned with a strong political foundation. Next slide, please. So as, again, I'm sure many of you will know, the Guiding Principles comprises three pillars. It'll come up in a moment on the slide. There is the pillar one, the state duty to protect, which is this notion that all states have legal obligations under international human rights law to varying degrees, but in any event, if there's not legal, there's strong policy foundations for all states to take it upon themselves to protect against human rights abuses related to business. Then there is the novelty that was introduced by the Guiding Principles, the corporate responsibility to respect. So for the first time, having a normative standard for what we can expect, the responsibility of companies, that they should respect human rights through acting with human rights due diligence to identify, prevent, and mitigate their impacts on human rights. And finally, there is the access to remedy pillar. I actually don't see the new slide, and I don't know whether I'm able to change it, but if someone can change it, I would be grateful. because it is a little bit difficult to manage. Oh, here we go. So those are the three pillars. I will now already shortly move on. But really, what is interesting about the guiding principles and these three pillars that we were in the tech space is that it is really designed with we're almost designed with the tech industry in mind. It wasn't, of course, because it's addressed to all sectors, but having a global governance framework that articulates these distinct but complementary responsibilities between governments and enterprises, while still keeping impacted individuals and communities firmly in the picture. It's well suited for the speed complexity of economic globalization and the area of tech where everything operates at a speed and scale that maybe the traditional understanding of human rights, where it was state-centric, where it was presupposed on nation states on a top-down level, were able to effectively enforce and uphold international human rights standards. The guiding principles has a flexibility to them that is still norms and principle based, but is able to we believe more effectively through the lens of the guiding principles respond to the challenges that we are seeing in tech. Next slide, please. So this now finally leads me to talk about the BTEC project. So we, as the UN Human Rights Office, obviously are working a lot in the area of tech and human rights. We have our special procedures, special term freedom of expression, privacy, etc. As an office, we're also very engaged in implementation of the UN's work on tech and human rights, the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation. And obviously, both inside and outside the UN, there's a host of initiatives and standards and processes that are aimed at addressing some of the specific challenges related to tech when it comes to human rights. From our side, using the lens of the guiding principles, we thought instead of a lot of these efforts might be either responsive, reactive, ad hoc, or reinventing wheels, there is a risk of that. We thought, well, why don't we try to use the framework that we have, the authoritative framework that we have, to try to see if there is a principled way one can approach the different challenges that appear, whether in relation to specific technologies or whether in relation to specific rights, as they play themselves out also in different geographies, etc. So we thought using the guiding principles as the lens to look at tech and human rights, we would add value by using this 21st century governance framework for the digital economy to as a powerful tool to try to come up with principle-based, human rights-based solutions that is applicable across different technologies, different rights, different actors. We're also aiming through the project to cultivate knowledge and improve practice through working very directly with stakeholders, including from the tech sector itself, but also with governments and with civil society, to come up with sort of guidance and not solutions necessarily, but guidance on what constitutes UNGP's aligned practice to create this sort of using that global framework to create some broadly acceptable, broadly agreeable expectations for practice. And all of this is underlined by the international human rights norms that are embedded in the guiding principles. And through the project, we can increase the understanding among business leaders, investors, states, and civil society about the expectations set out in the UNGPs. So the way we work in the project, the modalities, we have a very much of a networked approach where we are not, it's not a project that aims at coming up with a big tome of a report in a year or two's time. The field, all the issues are moving so quickly. So we are trying to employ very much of a dynamic and interactive process where we are both conducting research, but using very much engagement with the relevant actors to try to come up with outputs that are practical, implementable, actionable, and based on, again, based on international norms, but with input from all interested parties. We have so far on the BTEC portal, we have the outputs that we have produced so far. We have a series of foundational papers across the different topics that is covered by BTEC. And again, using the lens of the guiding principles and short action papers, research papers, summaries from events we have participated in to really try to get as much out as possible on an ongoing basis and in an iterative process contributing to shared learning as opposed to sort of working in just on our own with the key actors and then coming out with something at the end of it. This is really an ongoing dynamic process. I'm shortly running out of time, so I will just on the next slide. We have in scoping out the project, as you will all be aware, this is an area where one could come at it. There are an infinite number of issues and challenges. So scoping out the project, we engaged in a consultative process with stakeholders to try to see how, if one is not going to focus on a specific right, say privacy or freedom of expression, can one come up with sort of clusters or baskets of focus areas within which one can then come at specific business models, specific rights challenges, and specific issues that come up depending on where in the spectrum of the tech sector we are. So through this consultative process, we identified what we call four focus areas. The first one, where we focus on business models, where we explore and work with companies and others to identify avenues to address human rights risks related to how a company earns its revenue, basically how it does its business. And trying to use the lens, embedding the sort of human rights due diligence expectation into to also apply to companies looking at the core of their business model. We have a paper out and have some activities planned also in relation to that issue. The second focus area is related to where human rights abuse happen at the end use of a tech company's product. So it could be where you have a product or service that is not inherently harmful, but can be used for harm at the end use stage once it's left you, once you are managing it. So this focus area works very much on the practical human rights due diligence expectations and what that can and should look like inside the company. So we are working with stakeholders, but also we have created a community of practice where we're engaging directly with a group of companies on trying to sort of tease out some of the practical realities and dilemmas in how to improve and make the human rights due diligence process inside a company more effective. Thirdly, remedy. I mean, as we saw, and as you know, the third pillar of the guiding principles is about access to remedy. And we feel that in the tech space, this poses a particular set of challenges because of scale and speed, if nothing else. I mean, remedy poses the challenges for, I think many other sectors will say it's also posing particular challenges to them. But we felt that we cannot have a project based on the guiding principles that doesn't try to tackle and advance on understanding how to ensure more effectively access to remedy in relation to tech. So we've got a number of papers, short papers that are restating the foundations and how to think about it based on work we have done on Pillar 3. And we have a series of activities and events lined up that will try to work to unpack further how one can think about remedy in tech. And finally, the smart mix, the role of the states, the smart mix of measures that states can and should take and employ in order to foster business respect for human rights in this space and also ensure access to remedy. So those are the four broad areas. We have another additional work stream where we that is underpinning all four, where we're looking at the role of investors. The investor track, we call it. We have also a guidance note for investors, those investing in tech. What are the kinds of considerations and responsibilities they have as well to ensure that when they are investing, be they institutional investors, venture capitalists, or others, that they are able to not exacerbate the risk and in fact be part of the part of how one can mitigate some of the risks. We also have a cross-cutting work stream that is about outreach to particularly to different actors in different geographic regions. The discussion and the key entry points we have tend to be North American and European, and we see it as the UN as an important part of our mandate and our objective to engage and make this. These are global challenges, and we do need to hear and engage with actors from everywhere. I think I will leave it at that. I have one more slide that unpacks the investor track a little bit, but I think I'm probably taken too much time already, so I will leave my introductory remarks here. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Thanks very much for your comprehensive presentation on OHCHR's pioneering BTEC project. And I'd actually like to use tackled by your project models. Now, groups such as Amnesty International have said that the business model of tech giants such as Facebook and Google, and I quote, are surveillance-based and force people to make, and again, I'm quoting, a Faustian bargain whereby they're only able to enjoy their human rights online by submitting to a system predicated on human rights abuse. And Amnesty International effectively calls on states to end the era of self-regulation through further legislation, and in the short term, to strongly enforce existing legislation. The BTEC foundational paper that was recently issued and complements on that, it's excellent, I think, on business models. It acknowledges that business models are being increasingly criticized for their impact on human rights, and then it calls on companies to conduct human rights due diligence, investors to consider the UN guiding principles, and states to hold companies to account. At the same time, it presents a somewhat more positive view than the one I just cited, and it says that efforts to address human rights risks in tech business models must be pursued in a deliberate and smart way so as not to unwittingly take away the significant benefits of new technologies or create more severe human rights risks. And it then adds, just because a business model carries inherent human rights risks doesn't necessarily mean that a company will be unable to operate with respect for human rights or that the business model needs to be entirely discarded. So my question to the panel is, are there tech companies whose business models are inherently unredeemable, unreformable, insert whatever word you want to use here, as Amnesty seems to imply, or can they be adjusted to be compliant with the UN guiding principles? And if there are unreformable business models, or rather incompatible with the UN guiding principles, what implications does this have for the tech sector? And I'd like to first go to Nighat, please. Nighat, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I guess Lene has eloquently mentioned, UN guiding principles on business and human rights and 3 pillars, which is protect, respect, and remedy. And all these 3 pillars actually, define concrete actionable steps, not just for companies, but also for governments to meet their respective duties and responsibilities to prevent human rights abuses within the company's operations. And these responsibilities to respect human rights is a global standard of expected conduct for all businesses, actually, no matter where, irrespective of any jurisdiction or wherever they operate. And I think for during these times, it's very important where different countries are coming up with multiple regulations and laws to regulate internet and digital spaces, companies really need to know that it's actually mandatory on them to fulfill their own human rights obligations, and does not diminish those obligations in the presence of national laws and regulations. That's what we are seeing in our parts of the world, where different governments are making new laws and asking tech companies to comply those local laws. And I think I'll come to your question later, but I think it's very important to sort of set the context here that users around the world are not really, same when it comes to awareness about the platforms that they are using or the human rights obligations of these tech companies. These conversations are really not happening even, in the sector which call themselves digital rights organizations in some of our countries, right? So we are still focusing on online freedom of expression, access to information in the online space, right to privacy in the online space. And I think these are the fundamental issues in our part of the world. Now what we are seeing is that the more governments are making new regulations to regulate internet or regulate tech companies. We are seeing this is happening in India, in Pakistan, in Turkey, and other countries. There is a little bit awareness that how these companies are responding to the governments, and I think that's now the bigger question for human rights groups and digital rights groups here. But I think one fundamental contradiction that we have seen over time is between the ways these tech companies make money, and which is predicted on profiting off personal data, the model that we are seeing in massive, tech companies. And this model fundamentally runs foul to many of the rights we seek to uphold, such as the right to privacy. While interventions such as compliance with strict data protection laws, for instance, can improve the situation, this fundamental tension will remain there because users should not have to consent to having their personal life mined for profit. And this also creates a fundamental power imbalance between the users of these platforms and the platform itself. And the power manifests in the development of algorithms and modes of decision making about these platforms that concentrate power in the hands of tech companies regarding the kind of speech allowed on the platform, who gets to speak, and what type of speech is amplified. And I think, yes, uh, uh, things can be improved, with the kind of models that the tech companies have. And I think UN guiding principles around business and human rights should be the foundation, and all three pillars that Line has mentioned.
Thank you very much, Nigat. Wahyudi, I'd like to ask you, Nigat just mentioned that there are, on the one hand, systemic power imbalances inherent, it seems, in this sector, with the collection of data and with essentially data mining happening and possible or frequent, actually, violations of the right to privacy. And on the other hand, she did seem to indicate that, or imply, if I misheard you, Nigat, that this model is still somehow compatible or could be compatible with the UN guiding principles. What is your view? Can we have sort of data mining and data protection compatible, with the UN guiding principles in the tech sector? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think I got give the general overview. The situation on the South countries, especially such as in Indonesia, are still in debate to pass of the new data protection law, and it is not correlated with the discussion of the formulation of national strategy on business and human rights as implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Even in the technology sector, it must be admitted that the Indonesian government has not paid special attention in implementing UNGPs in the technology sector. The government just discussed about the issue of the natural resources, tourism, and also the issue of the plantation in the issue of the conventional business, but not reverse how the government responds with the emerging technologies, including the issue of the data exploitation and surveillance, etc. In spite of the discussion regarding the application of human rights principle on the technology company has independently developed, particularly in the protection of freedom of expression, as mentioned by Najat, and also the issue of the right to privacy. For example, the discussion on the personal data protection currently still in process of the deliberation in the House of Representatives in Indonesia. It is in the a different scope with the discussion of the business and human rights. So it is did not come as part of the discourse of the formulation of the national strategy. Furthermore, the issues of content moderation in the internet content governance in general to revise of the several legislation also not reverse how the issue of the three-part test in the process of the formulation of the UN guiding principles and human rights revert to human rights standards. Even Indonesia as a state parties of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The technology company itself is sure to accept the approaches which specifically address to the personal data protection and freedom of expression in combination with the general discussion to recognize human rights approach in business. That can be understood as the discussion on human rights and business in Indonesia especially is identical with the problem of labor, the conflict between the business sectors with the local community. Meanwhile, the technology company, it is operation is far from such issue. The technology company far from the issue of the labor rights, far from the issue of the exploitation of the natural extractive and also the conflict with the local community. As a description, the technology sectors which specifically conduct human rights impact assessment in Indonesia is probably only Facebook, which has global scope, not only in Indonesia. It is reverse to the Myanmar situation after the Rohingya crisis. Facebook conduct of the human rights impact assessment, including in Indonesia, and also responds to the situation in India, for example. But not specifically how the response of the human rights situation in the digital section in Indonesia. While the others perhaps have chosen to specifically conduct the data protection impact assessment as the derivative of personal data obligation refers to the several regulation. I think Gojek in Indonesia has the more experience how to adopt and receive the human rights principles in the specific issue of the data protection, especially because in the last week, Gojek released the new sustainability report with regard the issue of the data protection and the protection of the right to privacy of the consumer. So yeah, I think the experience from Indonesia in the process of the implementing of the UN guiding principle on business and human rights, and currently the Indonesian government still in progress to discuss creating the task force to formulation of the national strategy, and the civil society like us try to endorse the issue of the business sector as a part of the pillars in the formulation of the national strategy on business and human rights.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for that overview of the situation in Indonesia. Now I'd like to come to another Indonesian, Tana. Welcome. I'd like to ask you, as somebody that comes from Gojek, which was just mentioned by Wakyudi as a very sort of successful company in Indonesia, how does your company grapple with these issues? So there have been critiques of, let's say transport companies, car sharing companies, and so on, for their treatment of their workforce. There have been critiques, generally speaking, of tech companies, of data protection issues and so on, and breaches of data and users and so on. How does your company grapple with these issues? And what role do the UN guiding principles play in this regard? Thank you.
I mean, look, I think YUD set a very, very good cover of the landscape currently in Indonesia. For those who aren't familiar, Gojek is a tech company born in Indonesia, but we currently do have operations in other ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. But very much born and bred an Indonesian company. What does that mean? We were conceived to respond to some of the biggest challenges that Indonesia has. And I think in a lot of tech companies who have been born out of emerging markets have been able to leapfrog some of the challenges that peers from more advanced markets have had to go through. And so I think for us, we're in a very unique position and in a way privileged position to learn from the experiences and journeys of what other tech companies in Europe or in the US are currently or have gone through. All that to say, I think, look, my mandate heading the sustainability function within Gojek is very much to embed kind of world-class environmental, social, and corporate governance practices, ESG for short, for those who are familiar with that term as well. What does that mean? In some cases, it's retrofitting quite painfully different ways of doing business as it relates to our environmental and social impact. And of course, our compliance to laws and regulations in not just Indonesia, but all the markets where we operate. As Pak Wahyudi already mentioned, we did publish our first sustainability report in April. It was the first report done by a ASEAN tech company adhering to global standards. We use the Global Reporting Initiative and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, both complementary sets of standards to publish our report, and it was audited as well by PwC. And all of the indicators that we used, or the issues, the ESG issues, the big environmental and social issues that we disclosed our metrics or our performance on in the report, weren't just issues that we said or we as Gojek defined as were important, but we actually did over 100 plus consultations with internal and external stakeholders, which include civil society organizations, both local and regional and global, as well as our investors, policymakers, users, our driver partners, and our merchants as well, to tell us what they considered the biggest environmental and social issues or the most pressing ones that they believed a company like Gojek could address. So again, it was a 50-50 weighting when it came to that. So I think we can very much stand behind the methodology of precisely the environmental and social issues of which, under which human rights would fall into, that we are now prioritizing as a company. And I think using the UN kind of guiding principles as one of the many examples of international frameworks that we are working towards, if not already. I think this is very, very important to us. And what does that actually mean? We're actually embedding it on, let's say, our board level agenda, right? So, for example, every year that now we're going to publish the sustainability report, we're also going to have periodic updating to our board on our environmental and social performance relating to targets that we've set for ourselves and targets that we've verified with credible, external, impartial, and volunteer. I have to say all that, volunteer experts, because it's not just enough for us to say, well, we are definitely a low carbon platform, or we're going to work towards becoming a low carbon platform, and here's what our year-on-year targets look like. Actually, we're submitting our targets to bodies like the Science Based Targets Initiative, which, if you're familiar with, are very credible platforms that can help us verify and in fact correct some of the let's say the assumptions or the things that we're saying about ourselves. So I think all that to say, we want to be transparent. We're not looking at this through rose-colored glasses. We know we're not going to have the best performance on all of these things, but even more important as to why we should be transparent and disclose our performance as it relates to these big environmental and social issues, even if the government is still in progress working on some of these big legislations or regulations and parameters for business to then fall in line with. For us, it's very much, we know this is an iterative process, and we're very much supportive and going to work with policymakers, practitioners, but also on the ground civil society organizations to make sure that we are getting that kind of constructive feedback. And there's a constant, as I mentioned, pivoting even from Gojek's perspective as it relates to our governance and as it relates to our policies and our operations, not just in Indonesia, but all the other markets that I mentioned we operate in. So in summary, I think we are more than willing and happy, and in fact, very, very interested to use frameworks like the UN guiding principles to make sure, again, that we are on track, that we are setting the right targets, that our policies are in line with these types of best practices. Even more so because in the region, there might be some gaps and learnings that we can take from other regions that are more advanced and more developed on this and as it relates to human rights. And even more so, I think we can apply it within the unique context that all the markets in this region have to grapple with, which may not have been necessarily the case or the situation in, let's say, the EU or in North America. So that's it, I think.
Thank you. Lina, before I come to you, I'd just like to ask Tana a follow-up question. We've seen, I'm just wondering how your sustainability report and generally speaking, your business model, how it takes into account critiques that have been made of companies in your sector. So, these refer to algorithmic labor controls, these refer to essentially imbalances in bargaining power and so on. Does your company tackle these issues in the new sustainability report, and does it intend to introduce changes, or does it believe that its practices are currently compatible with the UN guiding principles? Thanks.
I think for us, this is very much still, we're in our early stages of this, and we know there's a lot more ground we need to cover and a lot more scoping and assessment that we have to do. That said, I think the biggest critiques, it's not that we don't know that they're there. And actually in our sustainability report, we published a list of some of these external and impartial experts that we're working with, precisely for the reasons that you outlined before, because we want to take those kinds of criticisms and say, okay, have a constructive discussion with them and say, okay, what does it look like for us to make those kinds of changes or transformations as a platform to ensure we're responding to those criticisms. As it relates to algorithms and, let's say, the engagement of our partners on our platform, we are very much, in support and want to adhere to ensuring that all our driver partners, our merchants, are independent, autonomous, have control and full disclosure as it relates to what and how they're working on our platform or how they're using or leveraging our platform. But that said, very, very nascent. I think we still have a long way to go to get there, but we are going to be transparent. That's the commitment we made when we published the first report. We are very much in these discussions with international bodies, as well as the local governments and local organizations, to make sure that what we do end up disclosing in our report in time for next year will actually be in line with some of these best practices that I think the UN guiding principles has laid out. But it is, like, I can't say this enough, right? It is on the agenda of the leadership of our company. We are linking things like performance and things like how we change and transform the infrastructure of our platform to make sure that we are responding to these issues before they become issues. And so how we're managing, let's say, I don't like using the word risks, because I think a lot of these environmental and social issues are already very pressing, and they are very much on our radar. And so as we're responding to those, I think it's very, very important to make sure that we have board level buy-in and endorsement of how we're managing and responding to those issues, and that we're disclosing them transparently in our report every year. So it was a kind of a bit of a vague answer, but just that all to say it's precisely because we don't have details yet, but we are going to disclose those kinds of things moving forward in the future.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for your openness and willingness to participate here. Lena, I'll come over to you. As I said at the outset, actually following on from your presentation of your project, your foundational paper on business models essentially states that, even though a business model carries inherent human rights risks, it should not necessarily be discarded because a company can demonstrate that it's taking steps towards implementing the UN guiding principles. As I said, this is not necessarily a view shared by everyone, with human rights organizations, NGOs, and so on, saying that there are business models of tech companies that are inherently incompatible with the UN guiding principles. How do you view this distinction essentially? And at what point do you think a business model is essentially, so structurally, let's say, difficult with regard to human rights that it should be discarded? Or is there no such point? Is every company redeemable, if you will? Thank you.
That's a big one, redemption. I think from our side, we're not going into this space on the basis that we are going to have a rating system or a listing or an exclusion list of companies. We think that's the job maybe of others like Amnesty and in the report and I mean I'm having no question with the different roles that also civil society can play when it comes to really pushing and making the arguments very strongly, and I totally respect that. It's not within the scope of the BTEC project to come at it as there are some companies that shouldn't exist. It doesn't mean that we couldn't think of companies maybe, but I don't think, also maybe from a sort of real politics perspective, if we came in and said we are making it the core of our project that we are going to argue against the existence of Facebook or Amazon or whoever it is, I don't think it's our job, and I don't think we would get necessarily very far. But I do think that there is a lot in any company, and again, without mentioning any names, but I think that as set out in our foundational paper, using the guiding principles as a lens and what it asks companies to do, I think one can get very far in any company who effectively implements it. If not, I mean, arguably, some will say not all the way, but very far through a broad oversight and strong governance structures. I mean, I really enjoyed Tanar's presentation and the sort of board level oversight, making this something that is part of the core commitment of the company. The company, it has a business proposition, a value proposition. It is there as a business. But the proposition of the guiding principles is that as you do your business, human rights, respect for human rights, identifying, mitigating human rights risks need to sit alongside and be embedded into how you operate. So I think when it comes to the business model question, is you can get very far in any business model if you have that deep embedding at the board level, strong governance framework to implement that commitment throughout the company, oversight to ensure that this is not just something that sits on a piece of paper or in a glossy statement. This is actually something that is lived within the company as a core part of how the company does business. I think one can get very far. Also, the understanding, and we heard some excellent presentations as well from the other co-panelists on the contextual risks. And I think that's the understanding in a company. If we're talking business models, the human rights risks in any business model, in any company that has a particular business model, will look quite differently, will often look quite differently depending on the context they're operating in. And so, for example, when it comes to privacy or some of the issues that have been flagged, freedom of expression, access to information, whatever your business model is, and if you're a social media platform, your human rights risk will look quite different depending on whether you are in societies where there might be strong data protection regulation in place, which does, and we've seen some efforts in the European context on data protection that actually did force a number of companies to adapt their business model with certain and having to take some additional measures. If you are in a country where the government is passing laws that are cracking down on freedom of expressions in a way that is not in line with international human rights standards, to the extent that your business model is based on people being able to freely distribute views and information online, obviously how you respond to the legal challenge and meet your responsibility to respect human rights in those contexts. So I think there's a lot we can do. Thinking about business models and thinking about embedding and institutionalize and going in through the corporate governance lens to really make strong inroads into some of these inherent challenges that a number of companies may have, because also, I mean, they were founded at a time where the venture capitalists who funded their creation did not ask any questions about this. And hopefully now we are a generation later. And I also again like Tanaz that she's sort of they're learning from the experience and that so the more those either governments, regulators, investors, civil society are asking questions and making demands, I think both with new generation companies that are coming up can embed and bake in some of these human rights compatible structures more effectively. But even with those that are from sort of more well established and earlier generations tech, I think there is a long way to go by effectively implementing what we have before we need to get to the point where we say someone should just not be in business.
Thank you very much, Lena. And the last thing you mentioned was we're established companies, and I'm going to move on to a very established company, Facebook. I would be amiss if I wasn't to ask Nigat, in her role as a member of the Facebook Oversight Board and obviously an independent expert and so on. I mean, Facebook has become the sort of lightning rod for many of these discussions. How would you respond? And I'm not necessarily even talking about Facebook as such, but considering the pioneering, Facebook Supreme Court, as some have called it, this sort of introduction of an oversight body, would you say that this is a step in the right direction, or B, a step in the right direction, but at the same time kind of putting your finger in a dam, essentially, trying to essentially guard against something that is inherently unsustainable in terms of human rights? How would you square the two? Would you say it's A or B? Thank you.
Okay, so I think that it's why I chose to become part of the independent oversight board, because I believed that it's a step in a right direction in some way, because initially when I decided to be part of the board, my intention was to have a voice in a board where I, as a digital rights activist, have been screaming actually outside of this space where the decisions were being made when it comes to a social media platform, especially from a region which is complex, no matter it is about the regulatory framework of the country, or the lack of awareness among users, or how companies basically operate in certain contexts. And that was the main, intention to be part of the board. But also, the complex questions around content moderation when it comes to the company. And also when I looked into the charter of the oversight board, it is there to hold the company accountable. So that's why it's an independent oversight board. But I would agree with you that they're like very difficult questions when it comes to the scalability of such kind of oversight mechanism when it comes to other companies, or how much other companies are willing to spend such an amount or investment on making such a self-regulatory body. So yes, there are some difficult questions there, but so far, if you see the kind of decisions that the oversight board has released, those decisions have, the center is basically the international human rights framework, also the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, different resolutions, different documents that have been released by the UNSRs on right to freedom of expression, or right to privacy, or violence against women. So I think the kind of decisions we are making, it's an institution in the making, but maybe we are trying to actually set right precedent if others want to follow. But I think there could be different models of self-regulation, but I think it's a right step, maybe for Facebook, for this company, maybe for other companies there are other ways to self-regulate themselves. But I think self-regulation is something that we really need, because there is a tension that we see between the governments and the companies, and companies really need to have an independent body who can hold them accountable, coming from all regions, not all regions, but different regions, and understand different contexts, understand different languages, and then have such a power and resources where they can reach out to the other civil society organizations and bodies who can contribute towards those decisions, the decisions that they are making around content moderation.
Thank you, Nigat. I'd like to move now from self-regulation to regulation. If possible, you just mentioned that self-regulation is needed, but let's talk a bit about the role of states. Essentially, the UN guiding principles, as all of you know, and as many of those watching know, call on a smart mix of measures to be undertaken to discharge the obligation to protect human rights and to help businesses respect human rights. And when it comes to digitalization, a recent survey found that laws and policies adopted by states are somewhat haphazard. That is, they're not necessarily well thought through, but they focus on the impact of tech on particular issues. These include essentially disinformation, content moderation, the spreading of false information, especially around terrorist activity and so on. At the same time, labor issues come up rarely, in only 21% of the regulations reviewed by this survey. And environmental and corruption issues rarely feature. So my question to you is, which measures should states undertake as part of their duty to use a smart mix of measures regarding the tech sector? And what issues are most pressing? What issues should they focus on more? And I'd like to first come to Wayudi, and I know that your organization has issued recommendations on integrating human rights standards in the formulation of surveillance policies in Indonesia and so on. So if you'd like to touch upon your work as part of this broader question on how states can help regulate the tech sector. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So refers to the three pillars of the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. For the first pillar, state responsibility to protect. I think it is the first process or first phase to endorse the implementation of the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. Because specifically in the issue of the tech sectors, I think most of the countries in the South region still in the process of struggling to the response of the emerging technologies, especially the issue of the data protection, surveillance, and also the content moderation. For example, in Indonesia currently, the law on the information and electronic transactions cannot as a reference in the response of the several of the digital platforms, including the ministerial regulation developed by the Ministry of Communication and Informatics. It is debatable because in the specific term, the ministerial regulation scope to the all of the digital platform. But the content of the ministerial regulation is just said about the issue of the content moderation in the UGC platform, in the users generated platform. But currently, in Indonesia also emerging so many of the online curated content platform without the regulation. So there is no what is the specific models or approach in developing of the regulation to regulate of the internet or technological sector. Is it will be reversed to the direct regulation such as in the authoritarian governments, or will reverse to the models of the self-regulation developed by the several countries, or we will mix in the models of the co-regulation. So the government is still confusing the Hello.
Hi,
Yeah.
wait, I think you're
So
muted.
Yeah, okay. So the government still confusing in the response of the emerging technology, especially the model of the regulation to response of the technology, especially the information and the communication technology. In the another issue, the topic of the surveillance communication, it is also relevant with the topic of the data protection. Currently, the Indonesian government passed the new regulation about the access to the personal data processing by the digital platform. It is also debatable because the regulations speak about the what is the limitation of the right to privacy, but regulated by the ministerial regulation because there is no legislation format specifically and to regulate about the how implementing the human rights limitation principles in the issue of the right to privacy, including the limitation of the personal data protection or limitation in the name of the national security, public security, etc., in the level of the legislation. So I think the first intervention to the countries may be how to integrate the human rights principles as a foundation of the UN guiding principles on business human rights in the policy level or in the legislation level. After that, I think we can discuss more specific with the tech company, with the corporation about how the corporation integrating of the UN guiding principles in the internal policy, including in the issue of formulation of the privacy policy. For example, for the first developing of Gojek in Indonesia, Gojek have one of the the appropriate of the privacy policy and term of services. But currently, after the European Union released the EU General Data Protection regulation, Gojek tried to comply with the international standards, especially the issue of the data protection in GDPR, and try to amendment of the privacy policy and term of services to comply with the international standard in the privacy in the operation.
Hi, Wayuri, we can't hear you again, or at least I can't.
Okay, so I think I have a problem with my connection, so come back to Mojondo.
Okay, thank you. Lena, actually over to you. So I just wanted to ask you the same question, essentially. What should states do in this regard? What kind of regulation is part of this smart mix? What laws, policies, are there any good examples you can point us to, either comparatively or regionally, with regard to regulation by states or regional organizations? Thank you.
Well, Thanks. I should flag that we've just yesterday actually issued our foundational paper on the focus area 4, so on the part of BTEC that focuses on the role of state. So that is hot off the press and is available on our website. And please, if I can also just ask everyone to sign up for our newsletter if they want to receive updates as and when these papers come out. I think just in going back to your question, I think really it's very difficult to come and say this is exactly the kind of regulation we have to this is what works, this is what doesn't work. It is what we're trying to argue is that sort of notion starting with a smart mix. It is what the problem is requiring to be meeting its objective. So, and that might well differ in different national, regional contexts. We and as the UNDP, you have done a lot of work to promote national action plans in the region, and we think that I think that certainly having a considered approach to look at what are the problems in a particular country or in a particular region or globally for that matter. What is the problem we're trying to achieve? What is it that will get this problem resolved, as opposed to saying, well, we can make a tech and human rights law. That's not how the world works. The kinds of issues and the kind of measures that government can take and should take will come in. There will be very many different layers and levers that need to be pulled, and some of them will sit in labor law. If you are if you are a GoCheck, then what laws and policies need to be in place in order for Tanya's company to operate with respect to human rights is not necessarily the same thing as if you're a telecoms operator or if you're in another kind of part of the sector. So I think we need to be just really clear that the smart mix is indeed something that takes into account what is the area we are trying to address? What is the problem we are trying to address? Is that a problem that transcends different kinds of companies in the sector, or is it one that is transversal? So there is no single silver bullet here. There is no single now this is what we're trying to do. One can come at it, for example, through a technology saying artificial intelligence, and whoever is using artificial intelligence, wherever they may be, because of course there are many non-tech companies that are using artificial intelligence, we can set certain parameters around, bias and discrimination and intrusion, etc. But it's so it really is something that is like the other issue, the first issue we discussed. It plays itself out in quite a context-specific way. So what one does as a state or as a group of states need to do is to look at it. First, you identify, you scope out what the problem is, you prioritize based on which are the most severe problems that we need to address. And then you roll out the kind of regulatory and policy levers that will address that particular problem. And again, I mean, just going back to the national action plans, it can be, it's not always, but it can be an effective process through which a government work with industry, with stakeholders, with civil society to try to scope out what are the kinds of problems and how do we prioritize which are the most severe ones. So I think, I think that's what I also wanted to comment a few things on the Facebook oversight board, but I think we probably have moved on from that. So anyway, but yeah, great that you to hear from you about the work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned a concrete issue. You said, it's not about necessarily tech and human rights, but, it's about various issues. And then you mentioned artificial intelligence, and I was actually going to come on to that right now. So with regard to artificial intelligence, there's obviously been a lot of criticism of its use, as well as, lots of promise shown. Just yesterday, I was listening to a talk by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, saying, one day we'll all regret not handing over more of our lives over to artificial intelligence and how it makes fewer mistakes than humans. So far from it being, purely a negative phenomenon, but there's been criticism as well. Obviously, Lina, you just mentioned bias, discrimination, and so on. So it's about the human side of artificial intelligence, if you will. So who is it that sets it up? And Tana, I was going to come on to you and just, I was wondering, does your company take these, let's say, flaws into account, possibly in its recruitment of programmers, others that set up artificial intelligence in other ways? Do you have any measures in place to tackle this gap, if you will? Thank you.
Look, I think with machine learning and the algorithms and artificial intelligence that we might use, and I'm gonna give away that I am not at all technical as a person. I'm more of a building block, tangible type of person. But that to say, there's a lot of very, very obviously very, very talented technical people that work at Gojek and in many other tech companies. I think we as humans have inherent biases. We always, irrespective of who we are, we'll have experiences that bias us. There, we'll have how we were brought up, to where we grew up, to the languages we speak, and the kind of language and words we use on a daily basis. The privileges that we have or disadvantages that we have. So I think all that is what makes up the richness and uniqueness of every single human being and individual. That said, can artificial intelligence replace that when it comes to trying to present unbiased recruitment processes, or even how our app interfaces or interacts with users and driver partners and merchants? I mean, if a human has built it, then there are going to be inherent biases in that, I think, and that's my own personal opinion. How we tackle that, that's a tough one. I think within Gojek, we have several things that are very, very much internal facing right now, but as it relates to how we eliminate biases from our recruitment processes, our promotion processes, how we eliminate biases from let's say in our leadership, for example, and ensure the best practices that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion principles. And that's something, it's actually I wouldn't say it's new, but it's something that, at least in Indonesia and in the ASEAN region, it's still something that's yet to be formalized. And so for us, delving into what diversity, equity, inclusion looks like in an Indonesian context, in a Thai context, a Vietnamese context, and so forth, it's not just about race. It becomes then about gender. It becomes about socioeconomic background, all these other things that have traditionally, historically, and systematically kept different groups of humans apart from each other and disadvantaged or advantaged. And so I think we're slowly trying to address that. As it relates to your question on artificial intelligence, that's not, I don't think I'm in a position necessarily to comment exactly what we've done on it. But I think, the other panelists have made some really good points that I did want to touch upon. I think there are, to me at least, there are fundamental human rights that transcend regional and local contexts. I think there are some where we know we have an innate sense of what is right or wrong, and whether we know. And I think even me as an individual going into this role at Gojek and the people that I work with, every point of the decision-making process has been, as a company, are we breaking any of those innate human rights? And the reason why I'm focusing on human rights is because I believe it's a right for my generation and the next generations, especially for me. I mean, I have children, so it's particularly personally motivated, that they have access to clean air, that they have access to a proper waste management infrastructure, that they are not going to be living in a city where we are now that will 96% of North Jakarta is supposed to be underwater, by 2050. It's sinking 12 centimeters a year. I think that's a right my kids have, that they can continue to live in the city where my family are from and not have to be displaced because of climate-related, climate-related issues and risks, precisely like that. So I think environmental and social issues for us is very intersectional, and that's why we're trying to address them in a way that makes the most sense as a company and as a platform. However, without policy instruments, I mean, that is the most powerful tool we as a society have to address some of these big environmental and social challenges. And so I think if we can work with government, if we can ensure that there are the regulations and laws that will not just hold us, Gojek, accountable, but also the other companies across all the many industries and sectors that operate here in Indonesia and other markets as well, that to us is something that I think there's still room to improve, and something we definitely want to see happen sooner rather than later. We're huge, not just an advocate, but our practitioners in multi-stakeholder collaboration and approaches to solutions, because we're going to have one perspective. We don't know all the other perspectives that might get us to, accelerating to achieving a solution faster than if we were trying to do things on our own, piecemeal. So for us, it's very, that also is very much embedded in our approach to all the environmental and social issues that we've, prioritized as a company. But yeah, I think I've gone a little bit off the tangent as it relates to the AI question, but I think that was something important that I did want to touch upon in response to some of the other comments that analysts have made.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'd like to move on to a couple of audience questions. The first one relates to monopolies, and I'd like to sort of filter it through my own thinking as well. But obviously, monopolies and human rights are not necessarily always, related, in the sense that there hasn't been that much literature on it until recently, because monopolies are a subject of competition law and other areas of law and so on. But there's been obviously allegations that monopolies in and of themselves are bad for human rights, that they're incompatible with human rights and so on. And we've heard of allegations of Amazon and others who have, become increasingly, let's say, difficult workplaces for their workers and contractors and so on. So my question is, the question from the audience rather is, what steps should be taken to prevent monopolies in tech? And I'd like to come over to Nigat, and I'd like to add to that actually, or should there be? Is that an inherently bad thing? Nigat, over to you.
Actually, I wanted to respond to the question that you posed to Lena around regulations and estates. And I'll come to that, and I think someone else can respond to the question around monopolies. Maybe I'm not the right person, but I would say that what I witness in our region, especially in my country, is basically the monopoly of the big tech, and also how different programs or different products roll out, especially with the users who have not much awareness or idea that what are the other products or platforms out there that they can actually use. And I would like to talk about the free basics by Facebook that was rolled out in Pakistan in collaboration with one of the very famous telecom company, especially among the users in the rural part of our country. 70% of population in Pakistan lives in rural areas. And that, of course, it was rolled out everywhere, but free basics really, became popular among the users who had no idea how internet looks like. And for them, this only Facebook became, like an internet space where they basically used to think that that's the whole internet. That's how the internet looks like. So when it comes to monopolies, that's how it looks like in some parts of the world, where users are really not aware what are the other options out there, or have no access to them. but the same product or initiative, the company couldn't roll out in India because of the resistance by different groups. And especially I would like to commend, digital rights groups and other groups who actually joined hands together and resisted it, that like the company couldn't roll this out there. And it generated a lot of conversation. But we were not successful in Pakistan because like 70% of the population who could get access to that product freely, of course they were like, something is better than nothing. So I think it's a question of haves and has not as well, and in what regions you are rolling out such products or things, where that the masses will have no other options. And I think it's actually also a responsibility of not just the governments but also the other bodies to sort of like monitor or have an oversight that how companies or other businesses are rolling out their products, and in what circumstances. That's one thing. And I don't know if I have responded this question correctly, but I also wanted to respond to the question around regulations. Although it's a little bit like moving away from this conversation, but I really want to respond to that because it matters to us. And what we are seeing post pandemic is actually emergence of an enactment of new regulations and laws. And I think governments around the world, especially in global south, found this opportunity where people are actually it's a matter of survival for them, and governments found this opportunity to enact new laws, and mostly laws related to regulating internet or digital spaces are really draconian. Processes are not inclusive. The problem that is scoping out of the different issues that Lena also mentioned, that's not happening. It's just one fine day you find out that, oh, there is a new draft of the law, and the cabinet will notify it in next few days, and you absolutely have no option except to accept such kind of laws in your jurisdictions and then impose those regulations and laws on tech companies as well. And I think this has become a very difficult and complex space in some parts of the world. And I think we really, it's an urgent thing that we really need to look at, because mostly governments are focusing and actors are focusing on pandemic. And while all the human rights work that we have done over the decades, we are leaving that behind.
Thank you, Tana. Thank you, Nigat. Thanks very much for the answer to that question. I was going to just go back to the audience question because I feel like we shouldn't leave it unanswered. Tana, let me cover to you. I know it might be a difficult question for you to answer as a company representative, and Lena, I will come to you as well. But are monopolies inherently bad for human rights? And if so, what should be done to prevent them? Thank you.
Look, I think as a consumer, I wouldn't want one particular company to have a monopoly on an entire industry, of course, because I believe I have a right to choose between, I mean, that's the whole point, right? So I think I should have different options. I shouldn't be forced to select one particular channel because that particular company has a monopoly in that sector. And so I think even at Gojek, we've taken steps to make sure that we demonstrate how we're aligning with anti-competitive regulations and making sure that we engage in anti-competitive behaviors, and that we're offering consumers the depth and the variety and in terms of their options and choices. That's, I think, pretty much as far as I can say right now. I mean, we did report on that in our sustainability report as well, what we were doing as it relates to anti-competitive behavior. It was one of the issues I think that came up from our materiality assessment. So the consultations we did with the internal and external stakeholders, this will only become a because essentially what we reported on this year will be our bare minimum, so benchmark. And so for every year moving ahead, we'll continue to disclose even more and more as it relates to exactly the steps we're taking from a policy and operations standpoint to ensure that we're engaging in anti-competitive behavior.
Thank you. Lena, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just very quickly, just on Nigat's point around legal developments in the pandemic, and it's something that the UN Human Rights Office and UN Human Rights mechanisms concern they deeply share. So I thank you for flagging that. It's not directly the focus of this session, but it is a very worrying trend, and I know also a number of companies have been trying to challenge the scope of some of these new regulations. But just on the monopoly question, I think from a human rights perspective, I don't think human rights law per se is sort of anti-monopolistic, but I think it's very, very clear that monopolies carry an increased risk for behavior by monopoly companies or companies that enjoy monopoly or near monopoly status that is not in accordance with human rights. So that is abusing their position in the marketplace to have practices in relation to their labor, in relation to anti-union drives, etc., to really set conditions across the market in the sector they're in that can have very detrimental impacts on human rights. But that's also where it's so important that government regulation comes in. So you have both sort of through antitrust, but that is about avoiding monopolies because they can be bad for a number of other things, including sort of economics and all sorts of other issues. But if there's not clear labor laws in place or environmental laws in place, I think the risk inherent with a monopoly situation becomes that much greater. So if you are a company, and just using the lens of the guiding principles, if you are a company that enjoy monopoly and near monopoly status, you would have to do very significant heightened due diligence to ensure that somehow your position doesn't engage you or doesn't lead you to engage in practices that runs contrary to your responsibility to respect human rights. And if you are a government that, for whatever reason, political reasons, is not able to crack down on anti-competitive behavior and through an antitrust, you would better have to be sure that at least when it comes to human rights related regulation, with, for example, environmental, social, labor-related, occupational health and safety, all the issues that can go out the window very easily, that there is that you are able to take measures to combat those, to address those risks.
Thanks very much. We have about 9 minutes left, so I'd like to end with a kind of final big picture question, but then, if you could make it as concrete as possible. And it's, I can't go through a panel in 2021 without mentioning the pandemic. I'm sorry, but I do have to ask, we seem to be coming out of it very slowly. Some people would say the beginning of the end is in sight, and it's ushered in huge changes in how we communicate, how we educate ourselves, how we access services, health, others. And sort of without sounding overly dramatic, if these changes do hold, it could almost be said that, the pandemic will change what it means to be human. So just about all of these changes have come about through or have been accompanied by increased digitalization in our lives. So bearing this in mind, how do you see the post-pandemic digital world and its implications on human rights, and which of the changes that have been ushered in, changes in standards on encryption norms, using national public health concerns to shut down free speech and freedom of association and others, which of these changes concern you the most? And are there any changes that you welcome over the past year and a half that you think, should hold once we resume normal life? Wayudi, I'll come to you first. And if you could keep it to a couple of minutes each, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So the issue in Indonesia, especially during the pandemic, it is about the acceleration of the digital transformation on one side, and the other side, it is about the use of the biometrics data to identify and the control of the people, including how the government disseminate the social securities to the people during the pandemic based on the biometric data. So in the future, we have the problem with the what is the processing of the biometric data, including the data of health and also the use of the several of the technological instrument. For example, the CCTV with the what is the facial recognition technology, and also the what is normalization of the use of the surveillance instrument to control and to take the decision by the government. So based on the situation, we need the acceleration of the process of the formulation of the legislation and the regulation, use of the human-centric approach in the process and the materials to protect of the civil liberties, and how the government try to balance things between the public rights and also how the protects of the stability, the protect of the economy, etc. Based on the regulation, and the peoples as data subject also have the instrument to claim their rights and also get remedies from the government, including from the corporation if the corporation conduct of the human rights violation. So based on the UN guiding principles on disease and human rights, we try to intervention to three pillars: how the government formulation of the policies, how the corporate try to what is respect to the human rights principles, and try to openings of the access to remedy by the corporation or by the governments. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So surveillance, remedies, and so on. Nigat, what about yourself?
I think it's almost a cliche to say that the use and integration of tech in our everyday life have become even more entrenched. But that's true. The way we work, communicate, learn, and organize in the online space has been fundamentally altered by the pandemic. And while it is difficult to see beyond the pandemic, since in many parts of the world the pandemic is very much real and growing in scale, we can anticipate that some of the freedoms we surrendered in order to track and stop the spread of the virus might become a regular part of our lives. We have seen tracing apps that have been developed and still being used in absence of any data protection laws and lack of transparency. And it is perfectly plausible that states that develop surveillance mechanisms to track the virus will now use the same technology to surveil the population in other contexts or under the garb of pandemic. And controls on speech have become even more enhanced during the pandemic. We have seen countries, for instance, clamping down on speech under the pretext of controlling misinformation about the virus, and how governments respond abuse and harassment against online abuse and harassment against journalists who are reporting on pandemic in their respective countries. And this tension, especially around tackling misinformation, has been apparent in the tussle between the tech companies and the Indian government, for instance, just recently. So I would just say that although there are some opportunities that we have seen in terms of accessing technology and digital spaces, we have also seen how we have surrendered our human rights in the online spaces very silently, and no one even noticed that.
Thanks. Tana, over to you.
I don't know that I would have much more eloquence to add to what the panelists and Leno, I think, after me would have to say. But yes, of course. I mean, look, we gave up a lot more, as Nigat mentioned, than we even realized during this pandemic under the, I mean, I don't think it was a guise, but really that we, in response to the crisis, right, the governments were responding to a crisis and as such required some of these data points to be able to surveillance, to control population, to control movement, and we willingly gave those up. So I think whether or not we knew the full extent of the potential damage that could be done with that data, and with governments holding that data or companies holding that data, that's, I think, still remains to be seen. However, yes, in response to this crisis, there were some requirements that needed to happen because we were trying to meet the crisis with the full force of government and private sector and so forth. And I think for us, it's still very much a gray area, about what Yudi already mentioned before. There's a lot of movement happening to try and now figure out those gray areas. And I think from Gojek's perspective, we would really much be open and keen to work with the government to make sure that those gray areas are figured out sooner rather than later.
Thanks very much. Elena, over to you.
Yeah, I really also don't have a lot to say to what has already been said, and I know we are short of time, but certainly scaling back of vast monitoring practices that have been deployed for good reasons during the pandemic would be very desirable, in particular easing the pressure put on private actors to share data with some governments. So learning from data minimalist practices that helped in some regions to fight the pandemic while preserving privacy, for example, preserving contract tracing apps is really using some of those examples, both for the remainder of the ongoing pandemic, which is absolutely, as Nigel was saying, not over everywhere. Not everywhere can begin to see the end. So incorporate data minimalism into everyday business activities for the remainder of the pandemic, but also as we are coming out of it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, well, that just about draws us to an hour and a half of our panel. I don't think I can get any more questions in, but thanks very much for being willing to answer the ones that I and the audience had, and apologies to those in the audience that asked a couple of the questions I couldn't get to. We were limited with time. I trust that all of those watching the panel will keep following this issue, because it rises exponentially, if you pardon the pun, in importance with each passing year, and with the advance of artificial intelligence and other technologies and so on. And I'd like to thank my colleagues who are organizing the forum again, and our partners. And I hope all of you stay tuned in for the next 3 days, where there's a lot more fascinating discussions on other aspects of business and human rights to come. So thanks again to all of you, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.